You're listening to Conflict Radio on the Conflict Radio Network. Greetings and welcome to Conflict Radio. Today is July 21st, 2020, and our guest today is Jared Murphy. We've had him on a couple times before, but we're going to bring him on again because we've recently discussed some topics with some other guests, be it Planet X, Crystal Skulls, and Giants, that I wanted to get his opinion on those subjects because I kind of thought it all flowed together. And in a sense it does, and he's going to explain how it all does. So I hope everybody enjoys this show. So we're just going to get right to it today. We will be back with Jared Murphy right after this. Well, welcome back to Conflict Radio. We're with Jared Murphy. Jared, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. It's been a few weeks since we've had you on. Has anything new broken in the field of archaeology that is interesting?
I'm personally really interested in this Egyptian chambers of mystery found near Abydos that Ancient Origins broke, at least put out that there were some chambers found. And what's unique and interesting to me about that is they were found really higher up from what would be considered ancient Egyptian living. It wasn't a ground find. It was chambers that were higher up in the hills, not easily accessible, except, in my opinion, to probably an older, more ancient society that would have had these interior walls as part of a larger structure that's eroded away. But it's a new find, and it's near Abydos. It's in Egypt, and it's super interesting.
So did they find anything inside? You said they're caves or they're ruins that have been carved out?
Yeah, so they're basically cliff chambers. They were enlarged. They're made right into the bedrock. They're thousands of years old. What's also interesting is that over the time there's been erosion. They're saying that there is deep wells from just water eroding the area. But these are new finds. These chambers, some are, they're 9 feet tall, about 4 meters. Some taller, so some a little shorter. There's indications, at least at this point, that maybe they were used for, as usual, surprise, surprise, ritual purposes. That's the first thing about any ancient site. If it was worth carving into something, it must have been a temple. And as far as any other details on it, there was just simply that it could be from the area, just maybe a stopping point before you bury your dead, and it could have been a ritualistic site to just pray. But these are empty spaces. All you have are the carved walls into bedrock, which are a topic for me. And the reason I noticed it is because that's what I'm writing about in my next book about our ancient megalithic past. Is there are rock-cut ruins all over the earth. They're in Turkey. They're in South America, including Buzz Aldrin, the astronaut, actually visited with Eric von Daniken and made an effort to go for a tour to attempt to find rock-cut ruins in South America. And again, in Turkey, in Egypt, in Russia, there are just continuously found rock-cut spaces, or in Petra, that famous location where they did Indiana Jones and the last, I think it was The Last Crusade, the one with 007 with Sean Connery.
Yeah, that's the ruins that's actually through the canyon, right?
Yeah, and a lot of people don't know this. It's been more and more well documented, but that canyon area runs over 12 miles.
Yeah, now wasn't there a bank? They're saying that there was a bank in there with a vault and everything?
Yeah, well, they're calling that the location where they were on their horses, when you see Indiana Jones, they're calling it the bank, and it looks like a bank, but in reality, what's behind it or why it was carved, it's not known. But there are internal, and this is one of the interesting feats about this area is that there are rooms, that there are chambers that are over 300,000 cubic square feet. 300,000 cubic square feet. That's an incredible size chamber. So not just one, but many. And so why, when you walk up to those chambers, when you walk up to these exterior impressive carved rock cut structure, you walk into a room that is what, can only be described as grand, but where did all the material go? What was the purpose of the room when, even as you stand in it, of course, it's a big, large rock cut space, and the echoing, there's questions about the acoustics and why is it so well acoustic? What was the finishing material? Are we looking at right as you walk through the bank, or to the left of it, one of the rooms is to the left, if you want to call it just a room and not a conference hall. But at 300,000 cubic square feet, did it have 3 floors? Did it have 4 floors? Did it have metal or wood or plastic as an interior finish? Because this entire valley has the same similar rock cut spaces that appear to be not for catacombs, for what we see under Italy or in some of these locations where it's like, oh, this is where you bury your dead. There's just a cutout. But what if those cutouts were actually part of communal living spaces for long-term security against either maybe falling asteroids, meteors, not great weather conditions? So these spaces could be way more useful as in the original setting. They could have been more for living.
Have you been there?
No, not Petra. That would be amazing. I haven't gotten the chance to go there.
I hope to get there one day too. I'm curious if there was a space there that might have been used as a landing pad for spacecraft, or not even spacecraft, but maybe even craft from ancient Earth beings that are still around today.
Yeah. There are so many caves and shafts that when you look at the surface stuff like Baalbek, Lebanon, or these large platform stones that get credited as landing zones, or I think that's part of our desire to look at, well, what could these have been in ancient times if they were not for worshiping and loincloth people to walk around in? They must have been landing pads or runways for ancient spacecraft or helicopters or anti-gravity. And so that's a great starting point, because it tweaks our filters off of, okay, well, we didn't really build laser cut, super tight, cymatic polygonal structures to just, put a temple oil lamp on one wall. These structures are too complex. And so part of getting that filter off of our timeline is wrong. I mean, that's part of, what my whole book, It's Not Aliens, Worse, It's Us, is about, is this ancient high technology is right there in these giant 3,000, 2,000, 1,000 ton polygonal, landing stones, in that they're so large and cut. Why would you build that big if a tank or a ship or a giant Hercules transport isn't landing on it and taking off? And so it makes sense. But then that only addresses our current understanding of aircraft, or even if we're discussing anti-gravity, straight up and down, magnetic fields, if we're talking about craft and landing areas, we're only left with these megalithic rock ruins. We don't see the finished material, and they've been readapted in the last 12,000 years. We have people readapting, repairing, just like the Sphinx, just like the ancient sites in Egypt, where you have multiple dynastic records of, well, the Sphinx looks pretty much like Robert Schoch and John Anthony West looked at and said, okay, well, based on these equinoxes, or, based on the weathering alone, it could be tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years old. But then there's these dynastic, the Egyptians that we know of, thinking back to Moses and our biblical history. We have repair records of the Sphinx got this repair here and it's got this repair there, but it doesn't indicate who built it. So at Petra or in Egypt or in Lebanon or at these landing strips, what we have is later cultures deifying and loving the space to where they care for it in a way that includes even their idea of the best repairs they can do at the time, and maintaining a site where it blurs the lines then, where was that the landing strip or was that the command center? Was it a communication lab? Was it a hospital? Was it a level of technology that had, was it a manufacturing facility? We're not looking at the true purpose of a lot of these, and we have to scale back our post-flood vision of each of these things, whether it's biblical because we have stories, whether it's the Hindu Vedas and we're looking at the Eastern legends and myths and stories of what happened, whether it's 2,000 or 5,000 or 10,000 or 1 million years ago, according to some of the Hindu scripts, millions of years of history, where this, again, in our mystification of it, we go, oh, well, God did this. When in reality, what we keep finding is ancient, high-tech human technology. And here we go. We have what looks like a landing pad, but in reality, it's built really, really solidly. So is there a good chance that the reason they built into cliffs like at Petra and they built large rooms outside of maybe being, again, impact, maybe at that point in the solar system and in the galaxy and in the universe, we consistently for a few thousand years kept getting more meteors. We've had different theories like Planet X or Nibiru, and did that planet break up? That there's this extra planet orbiting the Earth. And
yeah, we're actually going to get into that in a little bit, but I do want to talk a little bit first about giants before we get too much into Planet X. We just had a guest on, Doug Van Dorn. He was a pastor from Colorado. He talked about giants and how giants are the offspring of angels and man. That giants are pretty much their hybrids. What's your take on that in the research that you've discovered? And not only what your take is, but have you found any aspects in your archaeological studies that show that giants were discovered at some point and are being covered up?
Yeah, that was an early find right away. I started working on my book 4 years ago. And when I started, it was really quick that the Smithsonian, like the British Museum, would locate a new find via the newspaper, or there'd be an announcement that in Wisconsin or in Minnesota, or we have a lot of burial mounds. In fact, we have a whole town called Mound, Minnesota, and it was because there was many, many, many ancient burial mounds. And you would hear about finds of a skeletal remains of a human that would be 12 feet, 23 feet, 14 feet, 19 feet. And I started coming across, and at first I thought, okay, well, 9 feet, 10 feet, early basketball player, no baskets. And then you start
he's saying some of them are going up to like 12 feet tall.
Yeah. And so I saw those same ancient black and white early articles, and then you'll see, the Smithsonian comes and this site is no longer, there's nothing there. Everything's been taken to the Smithsonian, and then there's just no follow-up beyond the initial find article. So I did spend some time on some of those, just the old black and white articles of, okay, well, they found something. What did they find? Where did they find it? And it looks like, at least from what I could see from these articles, they were legitimate sites that were packed up and secured. And what was there was taken to the Smithsonian, whether it's been cataloged, left, destroyed, abandoned, and or not accessible to the average person. Sure. But from another giant standpoint, I kind of left the research alone, but I did do some research in South Africa in January. I was there near where all the stone circles are. Michael Tellinger brought that to my attention. That area, he's pretty famous for doing a lot of research in that area for what is essentially a forgotten society that made hundreds of thousands, millions, these stone circle enclosures. And this area is also well known. It goes as far back from at least a legend standpoint and some written information to Sumer and the biblical times, and was possibly, as far as a gold area, gone to and mined by the Anunnaki and mined by ancient Egypt and the great nation of Zimbabwe when it was still a nation. And we know very little about them, but the idea that giants were involved in the mining of gold, that they were either creating slaves or that there were, we're talking back to the Anunnaki, and from a biblical reference, that South Africa has many, many legends. There's actually, everyone's going to have to forgive me about this, but I met a gentleman and his son from a local Zimbabwe. They're not very far away. They had visited to the stone circles, and they came while we were there. And their tribe has a long history and a long oral tradition of giants. And it's not a surprise. It's not a shock. Giants were real to them. And it's an oral tradition that dates back over a couple thousand years. And it's not an unusual conversation. Wasn't just their tribe, but you have this entire area with fossils that are frequently ground fossils, that a lot of the plains of the area that I was in, which is just, for everybody who doesn't know South Africa, it was Johannesburg is about in the middle, and I was east of there by a couple hours. And that region, if you Google Earth it, you'll see many, many ruins from just zooming in with Google Earth. And of that, though, when you're there on the ground, there are fossils, mud fossils, or actual bone fossils, pestules, indications of human occupation that go back tens of thousands of years. And this is an area that was supposed to only have been occupied about 400 years ago. It's, you're at the southern tip of Africa. It's been a well-documented port from everyone trying to find a trade route to India it was a very early colonized, colonial environment that, despite that, it was coastal, and the interior was not really occupied by anyone in our modern times until the last 400 plus years. And of that, it's a very sparsely populated country to this day. There's only approximately 22 million people. So you can walk along the desert and find fossils. And some of what I was able to locate for giants was that in going to Michael Tellinger's Stone Circle Museum and looking through the countryside, there are fossils that appear to be maybe a heart. It petrified, or it's known as a mud fossil. And mud fossils are the concept that it's a known phenomena within archaeology that an organic substance can essentially turn, I guess the easiest way to describe it is it petrifies quickly.
Yeah.
So there are literally these surface fossils or mud fossils that are indicating, are they possibly giants just laying on the ground? And these are just pieces of those giants going back to that biblical war with Earth, with that conflict that is described, in and out of biblical texts. And, whether it's the Gnostic texts or biblical texts, it's right there. And as far as what I saw visually, there are mud fossils that do look like organ from what creatures, I don't know. But one of the theories is that they are giants, and that when they fell, and the reason that the theory goes that they are topical, that you can just come to South Africa, you could search the area. It's some of the best climbing in the world too, as a side note. But you can find these mud fossils, and a lot of the ruins are on or in large layers of mud. And that's significant if we're discussing that biblical flood or the Younger Dryas, if we're talking about this 12,600-ish year old, this basically the biblical flood, but now more scientifically being described as Younger Dryas, that there's this wall of mud and water that came through. And this is significant because the area I was in to see these mud fossils and this land that giants once lived in, that we're talking a wall of mud 40, 60 feet deep is how it's being left. Or if it's a consequence of a tsunami and flooding, and then the mud is just sifting. Either way, we're talking about an area that's approximately, the average height I was at was about 5,000 feet above sea level.
Well, that's pretty significant. So if you were to think about it from a biblical term, they were pretty much wiped out by the flood then.
Yeah, so when you match it and line it up with that flood myth or story or truth, depending on where you're at, what matters is that this is a well-documented, so many things in the Bible have been proven out to be correct. Their locations, their timing, and lining right up with the Younger Dryas is this annihilation of this whole area with a significant amount of mud. And I don't care how big or tall you are, if you're not swimming, you're not living.
Yeah, especially if you have to swim for a long period of time, I suppose. Like 40 days. Yeah. I'm not going to swim for 40 days. I don't know about you.
No, and then if you're not aquatic, where are you coming up with your next meal? You got to tread water and you got to eat something.
Now he claims that the giants are basically hybrids between angels and humans. Now, from your research, what would you say that they are? Like an entire race by itself, or do you think that maybe there's something else?
Yeah, I think I'm leaning on something else. And the reason is because of the work that it has been too long that we've just done morphology, where we've just looked at a fossil and gone, this looks like fill in the blank. And I don't care how good you get at looking at bones. The problem with our fossil record is that it's incomplete. So if we don't have a complete fossil record, we don't have a complete history. And I think I know we talked a little bit last time about the Paracas people of Peru, elongated skulled, alien looking humans, but they physically have a spinal column that doesn't enter where ours does. It enters in the back of the skull, not in the front. They're suture lines. Those lines, when you look at a skull, we have 3 lines. We have these sections of our skull that you can see because there's lines. Well, the Paracas only have 1. And there was genetic testing finally done, despite having done some blood work in the 70s on the mummies, on the blood, on the blankets, which showed blood types that don't belong in South America. They finally did DNA markers that as of last summer, indicated that at least 6 of them were not known to the human race. So when you mix that with the work of Michael Cremo, you have solid paleoanthropological evidence that humans, as we know them, have been in a variety that we are not fully documented in, that have gone on for millions of years. And so there's a lot of things that come up then when we hear a story about giants and we hear about aliens, or we hear about angels, or we hear about that there was Anunnaki and the post. Again, these are all documented human understandings of different faiths, religions, folk, history, Gilgamesh, that sort of stuff. And at the end of the day, What we don't have to compare against that we're only starting to do is this DNA research on like the Paracas and on other mummies. And so what we're finding is a greater variety of humanity and these genetic indicators, if we now compare them to these stories, is, and I think, showing that we have a high-tech ancient human ancestor that could trick, trip, change, morph, and choose the gene expression they want, whether it was, because they were doing it with plants, animals, and each other and themselves. So just imagine, like, instead of going in for plastic surgery, if you needed to be really tall and strong and work with maybe larger blocks, and not because this is not ending with giants built the pyramids. This is just simply that I think that humankind was around long enough that some of our ancient survivors from maybe the Younger Dryas or maybe a more recent cataclysm, maybe in the last 8,000 years, when there was still Doggerland, where England and Ireland and France still connected and part of New Zealandia was still a continent, maybe that there was memory of very big and tall humans that were giants. And the stories got built around them and the legends got created. And it's crazy to think that 4,000 or 5,000 years is not very long when we think that prior to that we were all loincloth people. But the giant ruins that we find, like the big buildings you brought up, the giant structures that look like landing pads, but they're really just foundations or they're part of walls to really high-tech buildings because of finds like the Paracas and giant skeletons that have been found. I believe Bolivia has a 23-foot human skeleton that they found that's in one of their museums. And nobody ever talks about it because who wants to talk about a 23-foot human, right? That's terrifying. And it's not something that would accept, mainstream academics to, they're not going to tout that one on the cover of Archaeology Digest or on the Smithsonian or National Geographic. And so it doesn't fit that paradigm. But here we are with a wider, that's the thing, is that we have to be open to the fact that there is a broader base of humanity based on what we have found in these ruins with these people, including the Paracas and their genes, and what we're finding in other animals. The idea that these giants were only placed here either by extraterrestrials or a god rules out the fact that just like we're doing genetic experiments now with 3D printers and printing meat to printing replacement hearts and livers, that the reality is that it would be very easy soon, maybe in the next 50, 80, 100 years, for us to customize, again, instead of going in for a nose job, going in and saying, well, I'm on this assignment and I'm working in this area and I need to be 23 feet tall and I need to have this kind of a bone structure. To manipulate our genes right now, we know that it's possible. We created sheep. We just copied a horse. You want something new in the news? We just genetically cloned a horse and it came out perfect. And these are the kind of things that we're doing with genetic technology now. But if we've been here on this planet for millions of years and we were building the superstructures that we cannot come up with an explanation for, we're talking about, do you want to build a giant? How do you make a chicken before an egg? It's really simple. You engineer the chicken. You engineer a creature.
Or how easy would it be to build the pyramids if you had giants as your workers?
Right. So let's just take the complexity of the blocks. The fact that they found, Dr. Joseph Davidovitz wrote on this, the father of geopolymers found, and it was backed up by people from Egypt and from Yale, that there are actual geopolymers in the Great Pyramid, as in they patched and repaired it. But as it's already been stated, you would have to cut, and from Aswan, the blocks that make up the pyramid, if you cut one moved it and placed it every 2.5 minutes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for hundreds of tons for some of these blocks and more, you would have to work for, I think, 26 or 28 years to put this thing in place. If you had an army of giants, if right now I think the guy from the Game of Thrones, I'm blanking on it, the giant, I think he's called the giant, right? The big guy that he just broke the world record for deadlift over 1,000.
Oh, you're talking about the mountain.
The mountain, yeah. He did the, and you know what? Forgive me because I read all 5 books and I couldn't remember his name offhand. And all 5 books, brilliant stuff. It was fun. But this guy just broke a world record at, I think, what was it? Over 1,100 pounds. He deadlifted. And what would an average 23-foot tall person be able to deadlift? Nobody ever talks about that. They're like, well, you make an assumption. They're a giant. They could lift a lot. But really, what does that really look like? Is 1,000 pounds even a thing? Is it just kind of irritating to move? Is it like a heavy bag of sand that you buy at Home Depot?
Yeah, I mean, to a giant, 1,000 pounds would be nothing, right?
I would think that I think that the muscle ratio on someone
like you and I
someone should really do a calculation.
Yeah, it'd be like you and I trying to move a 50-pound bag of cat litter or something.
Yeah, so realistically, you got 2 guys, you and I working as a team and working with larger blocks. But and this is why every time we start, I think it's important. Every time we talk about this in an interview or we're moving forward and we're thinking about our ancient past, this is where we got to do 2 things. One is there was a human society that could trip out their genes and go, look, let's you and I be 30 feet tall for the next 6 months. So we're going to program our genes to do that. 2, we got to lift heavy blocks, but more importantly, we have to make those blocks connect together so that they cancel out earthquakes for this area. So we're going to build this structure that's a giant frequency energy power plant. But not only are we going to cut big blocks, but they're going to fit together perfectly on every side. And they're going to either communicate or cancel earthquakes. So we have to have measurements and machines that can record those details. And so when we cut each block, we want them to fit together really, really, really tightly. But when they fit together tightly, they're going to do it on every single surface, on every single side. So we need to have the power tools to do that. We need to have, because this is not realistic. It's impossible. You can't take the hardness of these stones. It's already been proven. And with copper, get them to fit together the way that there's no copper sandpaper sandblasting that would have created the fit that they did. So, but when we step back and look at the idea of programming your genes to be a giant or the opposite direction, a dwarf, and well, why not be able to change just like a suit or your clothing? Why not be able to change your size as you do the work? It's a digression from the fact that we found larger bones. We know that there were larger people. Every single mythology on Earth has either giants, a flood myth. It's universal. And, yes, people maybe just take on stories that they think are really fun, but you don't get a universal flood myth when, by all indications and everywhere, our coastlines, what you and I look at, this world map that we look at and go, what was going on 10,000 years ago? Well, look at Doggerland. Just that alone. We're talking about an entire continental space from Ireland and Scotland, all connected together, not islands, just one giant continental space all the way through France and Spain, and all of it underwater. Now, England and that whole area is an island, and we take it for granted that this is the coastline, or that, there's a few hundred feet out of some ruins. But we're talking about a world map at 8,000 years ago that was significantly further out, hundreds and hundreds of thousands or millions of square miles of land that I have a map of in my book that show that would have been the true coastlines. So the story, the snapshot of where people were working and what people were working on and where is not an accurate snapshot. Just like in Egypt, for years, people talk about how 90% of Egyptologists today, standard academia, will say 90% of Egypt is still buried. And we've now, through like Sarah Parcak and the Global Explorer, when she won the TED Prize, I think it's been 3 years now, she used satellite imaging to contrast the cold stones under the sand and was able to map out thousands of structures. And she won the TED Prize for this. And so we have this story of ancient Egypt, Sumeria, these coastal areas, and these biblical stories and these Hindu stories. And again, tribes in Zimbabwe, and we're talking about giants. And we think, well, how possible could that be? Well, first you have to look at the full picture of what we're always looking at when we tell ourselves, is it possible or not? And part of it is, what did our coastlines really look like? So where were those total population centers? And what do we know about the human record in the genetics and what we find now, like the Paracas and just the variety of the human physical, cranial, spinal column, genetic structure, and what we know of Neanderthals and Denisovans. And again, there's a theory of evolution that, well, there might have been giants, but maybe they were a subspecies. Maybe they happened and then they bred with humans, and then that these are all side strains, that they were all independent, or that they were, or the theory is that they were lineal. But those are theories. But what we do know is that we keep finding these different races of, or genetic types that are close to humans or are human, but they're not the same as us. So we know that that's true. And so now we have this broader picture. And I think every single time we hear a legend or a myth or a religious conviction of giants, specifically, like anything else, we need to absolutely respect the dividing rod of the story is always pointing to some truth. It's frequently can be embellished. It can be changed for dramatic effect. But the truth is that we keep finding proof that somebody at some point saw a dragon. And I don't mean a dragon, but they may have seen a dinosaur, and they may have seen a giant, and they may have seen what appeared to them to be angels. And it may be just like Eric von Daniken in Chariots of the Gods. It could be, it's very popular to say it was aliens, because it's been very hard for us to look at our past and say we were capable of genetically changing ourselves, building with frequencies and waves in mind and earthquakes, and manipulating our genes like we change out tires on a car. If that's not too much for everybody to listen to right now.
Yeah. Do you think that they are trying to clone giants today?
I think every time we see this, I don't know what the medical term right now for the giantism, where you end up with Andre the Giant, like the very famous Princess Bride / wrestler Andre the Giant. You know, he's famous. And then there's a lot of really tall basketball players, or, you know, we see these times, or like that Chinese basketball player. I think he's one of the tallest that we've had. And we look at this and we say, okay, well, this is just a natural, the explanation is always that, well, it's an accident. It's just a freak of nature that the left gene went, right gene went, and turned this person tall. And
well,
I don't think
it's still in
their
DNA. Yeah. I agree with
and
you.
then that means who's manipulating it. I mean, we are never ahead on, obviously the military is not sharing how would they or use or manipulate those genes to recreate. And would we even notice, like, let's just say, pick an area that any military anywhere would be experimenting with giants. Would they be experimenting with humans, or would you even notice like when I think the Russians came up with those giant bunnies that are, they looked at creating a food source that was quick growing, that would be very valuable to the human race. And they manipulated bunnies to go to like 75, 50, 60, 80, 100 pounds, these giant bunnies that they grow very large, and it was supposed to be a food stock. And a lot of people have them as pets, but you'll see them holding up and you think they're holding up a St. Bernard.
Oh, they're massive. I've seen them, yeah.
Yeah, so what are they doing with humans, and are we ever going to see it? Because there's so many underground bases, there's so many facilities where it's not like you'd let a 20-foot or 15-foot. That would be an accomplishment. Even at 13 to 15 feet, you're talking about one hell of a big human.
Yeah, I couldn't even imagine standing next to somebody that tall. I'd feel like a little toddler.
Yeah, it's already weird. I got some friends that are 6'3.5", and I look up at them, and I'm 6'2", and I look up just like that 1.5 inch, and they seem so much taller. So much taller. You hit that number over 6'3", and everything's just that much bigger, to a point where you're like, wow, this is a really tall person. Or you put them, then you crank it up to like 8 feet, 9 feet, 10 feet, and then you hit 12. That's a giant human being. That's really incredible, because if they're experimenting with that, then what for?
Yeah. So what do you think their height? Do you think they're human hybrid in a sense?
Yeah, I think that's something that we're not fully giving ourselves. It's all about the presentation of the information. So something that we take for granted is, as I was doing this research for my book, because if you're trying to prove that there's high-tech ancient humans that still live among us, that the UFOs we see are likely possibly still high-tech humans that still live here, then you're looking at genes, and you're looking at, what do we know about them? Like, we didn't know that there was a double helix in our genes, and that it contained DNA, and that's how we program or manipulate or change ourselves. And then it took 24 years, and then it turned out that there was a quad helix. Well, that's news. And then, then we have these different humans, and we're like, oh, there's 2 to 4% of us have Neanderthal genes. And there's these Denisovans, and there are, of course, and I want to keep stressing this, because when we say theory of evolution, it is a theory, and it's stated like it's an opening now to a prayer, and then everything I say after is fact. Well, according to the theory of evolution, it's a theory, and it constantly assigns, I would say, in the paleoanthropological record, it assigns creatures we find in the last couple hundred years as predecessors to humans, when all we know based on morphology, not genetic testing, not cutting open and testing the bones, but just on morphology, the way it's shaped and the way it looks. Well, we feel that this is that's a very problematic in our research, is to just find something and say, okay, this is in our human history as a human because, well, we found it. Well, that's not evidence. That's just a theory. So what then can we say about this genetic information, and what do we have on that understanding despite mapping the human genome? Well, you have the Paracas with 6 genetic markers that are not understood. And the Paracas are from Eurasia. They're from Crimea. They end up in Peru, as an example. They have a neck that doesn't fit, everything we've already discussed, and they have 6 genetic markers. Well, that's just the Paracas. What about the other elongated skulls that we find all over? And more importantly, back to the genetics, we don't know what all of our genes actually do. It's kind of like having an alphabet, but not knowing how all the letters are pronounced. So how can you say we know the human race is, well, it's these genetic markers, and, oh yeah, we've mapped the human genome, and there's 6,000, these little markers we found inside the human body, inside the genetic code. Well, they're just junk genes. What, really?
Yeah.
I mean, what? The best neurosurgeon in the world will hold up their pinky finger and say, "This is what we think we know about the human brain," with the tip of their pinky, and
Oh,
that's just to make a point.
we don't know
I
anything about the human brain really when it comes down to it. We don't know nothing. We don't even know where
No,
consciousness comes from.
right, and I think that in looking at our ancient past, we have to move past the, hey, we just found a giant building that we can't make it with any tool today. The building that they did build based on its qualities, its ability to withstand earthquakes, its ability to possibly vibrate, or its high quartz content, the way the shape of the blocks are made, the tools that would be used to do that, the measurements it would take to create that, the machines it would take to move these blocks or set them in place, would also require finishing surfaces, whether it's metal or wood, that the genetic findings that we're finding within humans indicate not only what we call like gigantism as a oh, well, that's a defect. Well, what about synesthesia, these different abilities where smells and colors and depths, and there are just abilities that humans have that are considered superhuman now, that are all part of a system that would have been developed by very high-tech humans once they hit that window. The question is, did they hit that window 100,000 years ago, 150,000 years ago, 2 million years ago, multi-million years ago, based on Michael Kramos' work? If you already have, based on the Hindu Vedas, if you have the gods fighting in spacecraft or craft in the air, we're talking about not knowing for sure a start date for this technology, but we're finding all of it, and it's not just in the structures, it's in our genes. And when you look at them individually, you're like, oh, well, that's interesting, or that's funny, or that's a side note. But together, there's just this tidal wave of evidence that's not saying someone outer world. And again, I'm not saying that there's not people that can come here from another planet or another creature, alien, fill in the blank, from another world. But the indicators in the ground are directly showing us, and in genes and in creatures and in plants and animals, we could go off on the genetic side of it, but whether it's giants or whether it's dwarves or whether it's the Paracas, we're talking about a very extensive, genetically modified, engineered group of humans with technology and machining abilities beyond our current capability. And if we can't start imagining those technologies, we're not ever going to see beyond a saucer as an explanation.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now, I'm going to go ahead and let's take a quick break, and when we come back, I want to ask you about Planet X, because we did a show on that. I also want to ask you a little bit about crystal skulls, because we just did a show with Joshua Shapiro on the crystal skulls, and if you found anything about crystal skulls in your research. So when we get back, we're going to talk about some of that, okay?
Sounds good.
All right, we'll be right back right after this. Well, welcome back to Conflict Radio. We're with Jared Murphy. Jared, I wanted to ask you about crystal skulls. Did you find anything in your research on ancient humans and ancient civilizations about crystal skulls? Now, Joshua Shapiro thinks that there are 12 main crystal skulls, and they're held by the people, ancient humans that live in the hollow earth, that will eventually bring the skulls out, and when they're all reunited, there's going to be a great big awakening and whatnot with our consciousness. It kind of falls in line a little bit with your theories about the ancient aliens, or not ancient aliens, but the ancient humans that we think are aliens. And I was wondering what you thought about crystal skulls, and have you run across that at all?
Yeah, I got really fascinated with the Mitchell Hedges and the story behind it, and getting into the crystal skulls, and just, okay, well, it's really hard to work with crystal, and the personality of the skull itself, that it was a difficult material that it could crack, it can break, it can shatter. And so what was the purpose of the skull? And, from what I could find, there's these, mostly what I found was South American. Yeah, there are crystal skulls. Yes, they were used in maybe ritualistic practices, or were held by nobilities, or used in rituals by priests in South America for different practices that we don't have a lot of documentation due to the annihilation of most of the South American anything that was written. Unfortunately, due to our conquistadors, we have lost. But the codexes, the information is very limited. They're very rare. And so of the crystal skulls and their purposes, that as far as, again, post-flood, antediluvian culture in South America, ritualistically, they were used. But then what were the other purposes? Were crystal skulls, high technology, crystal information containers? You can hold so much information in a crystal. And are they part of a larger machine that you could either plug them into or jack them up into, or that, it's the same information that, and I kind of just want to touch base on all of like the generals of it for listeners that maybe haven't done too much on crystal skulls. And obviously you just did a pretty extensive show on them. So I think that the only story that I've heard in person being personal experience of absolute weird anomalies going on was actually from David Hatcher Childress personally. And David Hatcher Childress is, obviously he's done a lot of writing, done a lot of research, does a lot of different shows. And from a researcher standpoint, he actually had the Mitchell Hedges skull in his possession in his personal home. And he definitely, from his personal experience, hearing directly from him, there were just anomalies, energy anomalies within the home around him. And so the idea that this is a high-tech, ancient, or alien piece of technology that would or does have communication properties like a giant Wi-Fi box or a high-tech computer that just, to us would look like a crystal ball. Those are all, I'd heard the theories, and then my direct experience is really just his Childress's direct experience with it, with that skull.
Yeah.
And then, and then the research goes that, well, there's different ways to machine them or create copies or, so.
Yeah, well, they're making quite a bit of them now, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, they're really, it's a really fascinating thing, because you're like, wow, because there are these obsidian, and I think it does relate, as these obsidian spools and other really precious stones that are incredibly difficult or impossible to work with, like obsidian, where they just crack. They're very easily broken. And all over South America and Central America and in Mexico, there are these spools that were used. They could easily be data reels, and they were allegedly used for yarn to create, like shave the sheep and make yarn. And well, they really wanted something nice to put their yarn on, so they made perfectly cylinder spools of the hardest and most difficult crystal, jade, shale, obsidian, the most absurd things to even attempt to manipulate with to this day. And these spools can be seen in museums from Mexico to South America, just like the crystal skulls. They're made out of a material that we would cost effectively have no business even attempting to make a spool out of. So is it a high piece? Are these ancient skulls replicas, mimics of just another technology seen by a more ancient culture? Or are these actually pieces of ancient high technology that were shaped and left in the possession of later cultures? That's a possibility. They could have been intentionally left.
A lot of people say that the way the quartz is, it's not just your average normal quartz. It's a much rarer quartz that they've made these crystal skulls out of, and that is holding all kinds of quantum information.
Like a giant, like super high tech flash drive.
Exactly. It's exactly what they're saying.
And that's therein lies some of the experiments with some of these ancient objects that we take for granted that are, this is a basalt stone pestule, or some sort of they crushed seeds in this and they made cornmeal, or they made some sort of just medicine, or that this was a device just to bust up seeds and make powders. And you're talking about objects from crystals to stones. And this is like this is directly in relation to the 40 to 60,000 vases that were found at the Step Pyramid in Egypt, where you think, okay, they found a vase. Yeah, but the vase is made name the stone, just like the crystal skulls and these crystal spindles and spools. They're made out of the most delicate, most difficult. First, you got to find a crystal big enough to shave this thing into a skull. Then, same thing with these spindles. Why would you ever work with something that difficult? And then here are these vases, tens of thousands of them, in the oldest dynastic record, which is, again, how do we get earlier in technology, or you get earlier in time and the technology gets better? But these vases, which is not frequently pointed out, are so well machined that, one, they would have had to been done on a lathe. So you got a giant block of stone, just like a crystal skull. You have shale, crystallized stone of many different elements, and you're milling them down from the inside out. You're making a vase out of stone. That means you have to have something really sharp, so sharp that it can't even catch the smallest portion of crystal to shape it into what you want it to shape into. In ancient times, so thin that you can put your hand up and you can see through these vases, you can see through the spools, and they're all made out of material that have no business being in the shapes that they're in, unless if you're a high-tech ancient human race and you're genetically manipulating the body. Why? Because it's the same technology. You're talking about microscopic, nano-level abilities to manage delicate crystals. For what purpose other than waves and frequencies and energy? That's the only reason. And whether you're manipulating genes or creating, maybe it was fun to create a crystal skull. You don't need it in the form of a crystal. We would never walk along the ground and identify an old flash drive out of a computer or out of a phone. One of our Android phones right now, or one of our, pick the technology, but a hard, non-moving, simple little piece that actually contained gigabytes, which is something that I talk about in the book about genetics. You have Harvard scientists using genes to program in memory. They recorded a 54,000 word book almost 8 years ago. And since then, they can do about a few terabytes on, I think, a gram of DNA, a gram.
Yeah,
and you're talking about massive amounts of information can be stored within the human body. Think how much you could store in a skull, or forget the skull, just a crystallized structure that big.
Yeah, but if they didn't carve it into a shape of a skull, we would never pay it any attention.
Right. So maybe it was a piece that they wanted us to hold on to, because you got to wonder, because there's a lot of debates. There's a lot of different considerations. If you have ancient high-tech humans that either survived one, two, or multiple catastrophes, and they also didn't get along with each other. If the survivors of this, except instead of, like the TV show Lost, instead of an island of groups that don't get along, just imagine the whole planet only they had to pick up all this old technology after some massive event. And some of the groups developed back one direction, the other direction. Some may or may not have wanted to help some of the other survivors that only have the legends and myths of something terrible happening, interacted with some of the tribes that were maybe always peaceful and left alone on the planet. And so would you leave a crystal skull as something that you could jack back into later and upload or download the technology? Or it's not as simple as where we go with this antediluvian. I think, again, you're taking, I think it's important to not just simplify it and say, it's because it's so fascinating. It's so exciting that the idea that it's just automatically mystified, that's a magical crystal skull, not a high-end, a high-end piece of technology that was left specifically for us to find. Or if they had shaped it into that, I always kind of feel like, what if it was a giant block of memory, of information, and really they used every corner of it, even on the quantum level? And then, well, let's leave 5, 6, 10 of these around for the human race to eventually, at least this other human race, they're not ready. We can't bring everybody up. So some of these high-tech humans continue on, and they're back to flying anti-gravity machines, and we see them from time to time, more and more witnesses that aren't military UFOs, but actual like high-tech human ancestors that I'm theorizing on. Meanwhile, give the rest of them these skulls and these other indicators, the groups that do want to interact with us, like, well, this is going to be a piece of the puzzle that they're going to be able to reconstruct later. Let's leave it with them in a form that they won't throw it away. And a crystal skull, for a while gets to be a worship object for a few thousand years, but they ain't going to throw it away.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what Joshua Shapira says, that it's left over from our ancient ancestors who had high technology. They left it out there to find these, tribes found them, out and about, and set them up and worship them. And that's great. They saved them. Now we have them. They're in museums or wherever we have them all over the world. And even though we don't have the technology today to read them, we will one day.
Yeah, well, and here's the irony. What if, what if it's like every recipe for every Italian pizza crust that you could ever want? What if it's like the Betty Crocker of the last 10 million years of recipes? This is how you cook a Triceratops.
It's a cookbook.
Bake. The assumption is that it's going to be really useful information. What if it's more of the mechanics of, in order for you to access this information, it will unlock your needs it will also help you understand the needs of free energy, of communication. It's not so much the content of that, but there will be content. But I got to go back to it could be the DNA memory, because right now, I could not remember. It was like 215 gigabytes is what we can now currently store in information in a gram of DNA. So you yourself walking around right now may contain enough ancient information. And this is a fact that we have what we call passed down memory from, just a trauma, but they've been able to prove it. But imagine your entire human body is walking around as a backup for the human race. You have people coming forward and saying, well, I believe I was Cleopatra before I was born.
Yeah, they're always somebody famous.
Yeah, it's never Bill, the guy, the zookeeper that cleaned up after the elephants. It's never, nobody had that job. But the DNA memory of every human on Earth could be backed up in a human vessel. And that means that when you do fixate on someone famous that you know of in history, what if the particulars, like really certain details that no one's ever written about, no one's ever theorized about, but in reaching back in our genetic memory, if we're only 10 to 14% conscious now, what if those revelations as you remember someone's past life. It's not that you were that person. You have their memories because you're their backup. And for Bill, the elephant guy.
Yeah, it's all there, right?
Right. So we're looking externally right now, and it's important for us to look at the crystal skulls and any other ancient find, especially, I think, these spools or the schist disc. You know about the schist disc in Egypt. It's a very famous, for anybody listening, it's the schist disc. Here's the funny thing, they won't let anyone look at it right now. They won't let anyone touch it. It's a disc that was called a incense burner, but it very much looks like it's a very fragile stone, just like the crystal skulls, in that to shape this, it looks like a fan that should go in front of a radiator or for a vent fan. And it very much looks like it should be on a flywheel. It should just be on a device. It was put back together. It's in one of the museums in Cairo. It's called the schist disc. You can look at pictures of it. But this is a high-tech piece. Why make it out of stone in the shape of a fan that should be like a part on a device if it's not exactly that? And these stones, these spools, could be pieces of technology that relate to that. Whereas if, again, the theory of evolution, you get something through a forced adaptation. So if we're at 10 to 14% consciousness, then at some point on the theory of evolution, this isn't like the minimum brain size, I think, for us to do what we do now. I think that we're more like in safe mode, like a computer. And when you look at things like the crystal skulls, these spools, the schist disc in Egypt, and so many other items like it, you're looking at what appears more like the very consciousness we're living with, and these abilities we keep reactivating are indicators that all of it were part of a memory energy communication system. So whether it's an external device like a crystal skull, or whether it's your actual DNA and you're having flashbacks, or you think you're having flashbacks to a past life, it's more like you accidentally every now and then connecting to what may have been a wider organic computer system. So,
yeah, and that's if our entire existence isn't a computer system, like a hologram, as some people believe.
Yeah, which pill do you want to take? If you could.
That's interesting. I'll tell you, there's so much fascination in all of our history as far as what all of this really is, what's really going on, what's our reality. It's so interesting. I have the pleasure of speaking to so many different people, as far as, the history of humans and what's really going on. My mind is blown on a weekly basis, it seems.
Yeah, and then I think part of it is self-experimentation. It's like, how do you apply it? And there are people out doing these things, and by apply, I mean like people like Wim Hof, the Iceman. I got the opportunity to meet him. I write about him in the book about being superhuman. They called him the Iceman because he had held 26 world records for everything from running a marathon barefoot in shorts at 20 below zero and maintaining his body temperature, and being and in multiple settings, multiple times, being video and documented by scientific teams to consciously control his immune system, his inflammatory response. And this is not considered medically possible. And how does it relate? Well, if you can consciously control your inflammatory response, like for disease, like just being under the weather, or being able to control your temperature and never be cold again, or be able to control yourself in heat. This is something that Wim Hof has actually been able to do. And I got to meet him the first time he came to America and learn his methodology, which is a combination of breathing a very specific way. And he is out to teach. He's like a madman. He's out to teach everyone to do it. He's out to teach children, adults, and he's doing it. And it's actually being proven to indicate that this is an ability that he preaches. Not like a religion. He's preaching this is an ability we forgot that we all have and that we all can do. And his big thing, and I'm going to say it the most polite way, because anyone who's heard Wim Hof or heard him in person, he doesn't say it as politely, but he says we need to demystify. And the reason is because these are technical abilities of our genetics that allow us to not be cold in 20 below zero, to not be cold, but to be actually warm and enjoy it, like really down to shorts, barefoot, that you could be in this environment, not only not die, not get frostbite, but actually control your, what he calls inner fire. And I've been able to do that. I've been practicing it for 3 years, but this is just, and then the inflammatory response, being able to either be less sick or sleep better, or to control how you feel, not just in a moment, but through an inflammatory response, which would be very useful as you are or getting sick. And these are things that we've been able to duplicate now in a scientific setting. And it doesn't indicate something new. It indicates something we're remembering how to do. And so this awakening you were talking about is something that also starts with us hearing about what one of these breakthrough people or these concepts that you and I are discussing, or like what I'm writing about, or what everyone else is just rediscovering, is applying it personally. Have some fun with it. Try doing something like Wim Hof is something you can learn how to do in 15 minutes. And then next thing you know, you're having, this is not just a peaceful meditation. I mean, we're talking about controlling your inflammatory response, but also being very connected again in a way. It is kind of an awakening. And this is part of that process, is to learn about each of these. Yeah, there's an external device that could contain a lot of memory, like the crystal skull. We have these internal deja vus. They could be our memories. They could be a past memory. They could be, like you said, is it more of a matrixy type thing? Or is it just in our process of reawakening, are these genetic memories that we have of this continued, maybe multi-million year existence on this planet, are they resurfacing as we kind of become, I think, quickened in our response, or are quickened in our awakeness? These are real things.
Yeah. So I wanna move on to, because we're running out of time. I want to move on to Planet X a little bit. You write about this in your book, don't you?
Yeah. There is a lot of serious education. I mean, yes, this is a real thing.
I want to interrupt you just to remind the listeners that we had a Marshall Masters on. I think it was episode 6, where we discussed Planet X is really it's a binary star system called Nemesis, or Planet X isn't it's just another star that we are in a binary star system, and that the star is called Nemesis, and there are some planets that are evolving around Nemesis, one of them being Nibiru, if I say that right, and that it's eventually it's on its way here now. It's getting closer and closer, and it's what's causing a lot of our earthquakes and you know the core of the Earth to so-called heat up, and we're going to start seeing a lot of residual asteroids and debris and stuff that we're going to wind up flying through. Now, what do you think Planet X is?
Well, I rely on Caltech, in this case, 2 scientists that I write about. I do touch on Planet 9 because the question is, if humans have been on this planet in the form, not half evolved, in the last 2 million years, if we've been anatomically correct humans walking around, as the evidence of the ground has been finding, like, well, okay, what stories do we have of, in our knowledge base, where are we from? And the first and foremost in Western science is the Anunnaki, which are a mythology brought to us by Sumerians.
Yeah, they're actually the residents of Nibiru.
Right. So they have this whole rundown that here's the picture of our solar system, here's this other planet that is circling, and they're from there and they come here, and well, you gotta look it down because it's very specific. And then they have cuneiform, they have inscriptions that show a mystery planet if you're looking at all the planets. And I mean, that's a side note that's been brought up a lot, I guess, to how is it that they knew that there were rings on one of the planets? How would they know that? But again, the Sumerians had a lot of odd things. They're not the planet 9 is not the only thing that I write about, in that we won't go into it now, but it's the Babylonian Plimpton tablet. There are 2 cuneiform tablets that were found, that one shows a much more complex version of what we give credit to Pythagoras for. And they got a teacher's tablet, a working tablet that appears to be a tablet that would have done that math 1,000 years before Pythagoras. And then they have another tablet that shows that they're working with spherical geometry. And that's just a couple cuneiform tablets. And there, to this day, millions of tablets that we have not translated yet. And it's not like they know which ones are important and not, but we have translated some of these stories from Sumer, including like the kings list that says pre-antediluvian, there was 8 kings that lived. They ruled, cumulative, all of them together. Their summation was approximately 265,000 years, that 8 kings lived over 30,000 years apiece. And in this time, the Anunnaki come from this deep planet 9, from somewhere deep in the solar system, within this, what we now believe, if you're going to be inhabitable, or the habited Earth is one of many planets that most likely have 2 suns, 2 stars, which is why we keep saying binary. And that, for most people, I think when we look out in the stars and we're saying, oh, there's other Earths out there, and those Earths include binary star systems, that means that anything that's habitable has 2 stars, and there's at least 2 Earths, or 2 Earth type capable of holding life planets. And here's Nibiru. And how do you not chase that down? Because, well, that's a realistic assumption. It would be a lot easier to get here from Earth, another Earth that is actually, and I thought we'd pause for the commuter rail, because I don't know if you picked that up or not.
Yeah, that's all right. It's a quick moving train. It seems like it's gone already.
It is. All right. Yeah. So these Caltech scientists that I like to quote, Constantine Battigain and Mike Brown, they mapped out a hypothetical orbit because they were able to draw on that. I don't know if he touched on this or not, or if you talked about, they were able to map out based on that outer ring, the Kuiper belt, or a Kuiper belt, the band of icy objects that we have around the solar system. And there's a draw on our planets. There's a draw on our planet that is not explainable.
Yeah,
if you
he
don't
did mention that.
Yeah. Yeah. So you have to count on, okay, why do we have this pull unless it's not another planet that's cycling around? And their Caltech, this is fairly recent, they theorized that the orbit for this other planet is 15,000 years. So you do not need to be interdimensional space traveling aliens, well, if you don't count a neighboring planet, to have developed technology to only jump one planet over in a 15,000 year orbit. At some point on that orbit, you would be closer to Earth than not. And at some point, sending a ship at a more advanced level, but maybe not interdimensional, you could get a group of people here. And they may have gotten their technology far enough along that the ancient Sumerians are actually telling the truth, that the Anunnaki are real, that they are from a nearby planet, and they needed gold, apparently. And that, to me, was where I had a hard time with it, because if you're interdimensional space traveling, you have control of quantum science. And of that, what does that mean? It means that if you want to pop out a 3D printer and grab a series of atoms from the air and you want to create gold, you don't need to go to another planet and mine minerals. You just
well, they wouldn't
print
be
them.
they wouldn't be interdimensional if they were coming here from Nibiru every 15,000 years.
No. Obviously, they reached a certain level of technology that they had become space traveling. But I have a hard time that even with the tech, like right now, maybe we are lucky. Maybe this time round, knock on wood, a massive cataclysm, maybe this time around with the technology and the way that our minds are, and again, I think that if we're at 10 to 14% consciousness, then we're likely more in like a safe mode, like a computer that's just kind of working on the minimum. And if at this time we're able to figure out how to 3D print skin and livers and hearts and kidneys, and we're back at a point where we're redeveloping and actually 3D printing food, that this time around maybe it is unique to us that we were able to understand nanotechnology the way we do here and now. And is it possible that somehow another society could create space travel just enough to get to the nearest planet, but not enough technology to come up with a solution for their atmosphere? The theory was Nibiru, according to the Anunnaki, according to the Sumerian legends, is that they needed gold for their atmosphere because their planet's atmosphere was failing. And I kind of feel that story is a very alchemist, medieval, kind of classic 50s saucer sort of mentality.
I don't agree with that either.
Yeah, it's like understanding, like if you don't understand nanotechnology, if you don't understand quantum sciences, if you don't understand like Ken Wheeler's work on magnetism, I think that has been brilliant, and I think that it's pretty clear that you don't travel to another planet to ship gold anywhere or minerals. That's a very low tech concept of what, if you're dealing with nanotechnology, you're just not doing that. So I think Nibiru being a real planet, is it possible that they reached a level of technology, if that planet exists and there are people or our ancestors on it, could they have come here in a group, multiple craft? Could they have started here and really populated the planet as a secondary, and here's the assumption. We're assuming we're the seed planet. What if it all started here and they went there?
Who's to say we didn't seed them?
Right, because frequently right now, one of the things, we started the show with what's new news, and one of the things that I've been watching closely, and I don't feel like screaming about yet or about any excitement, is they're talking about that signal that's been bouncing back to Earth, very directed, very consistent, and there's a signal. And think about it. If we reached a level of technology that we did, that we were building the structures we did, and we sent out satellites into deep space that were communicating back here, and we were building, I think one of the reasons we built at the scale we did, we're talking about people who are building at a scale that is not used to doing megalithic and catastrophic work. I mean, you're talking about, if you're going to be hit by a 60-foot wall of mud, you're talking about people who are possibly used to being hit by large catastrophic events. And they're talking, why not build at a layer and scale that represents, a survival? So if you're building that big and you're used to those kind of impacts and you've lived for millions of years, it's very likely that you've sent out satellites and technology that could be broadcasting after a significant amount of time back to Earth. And that is something that we don't think about. We think that the objects or signals that are coming here are foreign. If you, again, compile the technology from genetics to structures, the point is that you're talking about SpaceX, ancient SpaceX technology that is way out there. And whether it's seeding us, seeding Nibiru, seeding or working on Mars or moons, we're talking about extended archaeology that may include, and something we don't frequently talk about, high Earth object satellites that may not be satellites that are not, they're not alien, they're just satellites that are here. They're local. They are from this planet, and they're still operating or just functionally operating. And that changes, I think, the paradigm.
Yeah,
a lot.
And you mentioned Mars. I really believe that Mars was once inhabited and once had an atmosphere very much like Earth. What are your thoughts on that?
I was thinking about that recently too.
Like just throwing that out there.
Yeah, well, if we've been here for millions of years and we've advanced further, and based on the technology we have, I think it would have been really easy to be off-world. And of the places we've gone, I would think that Mars would have been an easy place to be, or some of the moons, or both. And again, a lot of what people, and I think that we could have occupied it colonially and had a more extended, that's the thing. Like, one of the questions that people always go back to, and I spent a lot of time looking at this, is what would have collapsed? What impact? The assumption is like the crater in Greenland that's 19 miles in diameter. That would have been terrible to be around here for. But we assume that it might have been a giant natural disaster. The question then is, what would be that disaster if it was actually war, if it was a fight, if it was a conflict between multiple locations, and really just a human conflict, an advanced human conflict that left this planet devastated, Mars annihilated, and Nibiru lost in space. The reality is we could have knocked our entire extended human existence back to exactly where we did, which was essentially the Stone Age.
Yeah, and if we're not careful, we could very much do that again.
Yeah, it seems like simultaneously we're awakening, and simultaneously we're getting more difficult.
Yeah, these times, they sure are. They're weird. I really don't want to get into them.
No, let's stick with Mars.
Yeah, we can't really talk about what's going on today because we'll be blacklisted.
No, I think Mars is, well, what's interesting, again, it goes back to, if you start with the paradigm that it's not aliens, worse, it's us discovering our lost history, you're literally talking about, they would easily have advanced satellites. They would have easily sent out, imagine a million years ago, if you launch your first Voyager, how far away would that Voyager be at this point? And as your technology increases, would your newer advanced deep space satellites have gone further? Would they have connected? Would they have collaborated? Would they have sent a signal back? And are they still being relayed? Are they self-repairing? What kind of technology continued to go into space, and or us? How far did we get before we stopped? I mean, part of, if we got back to Mars, if we get back to the dark side of the moon, if we really started being honest about some of this digging, or even in orbit. Oh, that's exactly what I was going to mention, is that when we talk about the Hubble Space Telescope, we have these telescopes that can take actual photographs that we enhance, and we look at, they're actual photographs of distant galaxies or distant space objects, and we can get so much detail.
I was looking at a photo of one of those images just a couple days ago, and it's absolutely incredible the amount of galaxies that are out there. I mean, there's thousands of them. Yeah,
and what a lot of people don't know, and honestly, I didn't really think much about it myself, is that when you hear about radio frequency telescopes, what we're not understanding is that when they're taking photos, this radio imagery is not a picture. It's not a photograph. It's not a image like you're seeing from these direct lensed, just above our atmosphere satellites. These radio frequency telescopes are they're interpreting signals, frequency signals. So you're not getting, and I'm not dumbing it down. I'm just simplifying it for the sake of the point that you're not actually getting an image as you want to get it from your cell phone when you snap a photo. You're getting it's just a frequency. And so they're doing artist interpretive. When you look at a lot of these caption photos, they are starting to point it out more that this is a artist interpretation. So we create this imaginary vision of some of these images that we say they've recorded and seen, or these like the Dyson spheres, or the theory of Dyson spheres, and then what they might look like, or we found a signal for this black hole that's, trillions of miles away. But the reality is it's a radio frequency signal. It's not an image as you're thinking of it. And so as we it's so hard to back up and go, look, we got really advanced. We had a lot of technologies. We would have sent out satellites. We would have sent out space stations. We would have gotten maybe beyond Mars. And what's left of those stations or buildings, or you fill in the blank, could still be there, and they maybe have been pounded by meteors and you name it, and dust storms, and just wasted. But the remnants of those buildings or those structures are possibly still going to be there. And more importantly, the signals from some of these satellites that they could have sent out could easily be coming back now. Yeah. And we just don't recognize the signal pattern.
Now let's say, for instance, that this is a binary star system, and we did have Nemesis come through, say, 15,000 years ago, give or take, and it was being rotated by these other planets were rotating around it. Say there's 3 other planets, and one of them's Nibiru, and it's coming in 15,000 years ago, and goes by. Is there evidence on the Earth today that there could have been this catastrophic pass-by of Nemesis?
Yeah, it could be that the mud flows that we found in South Africa. It could be the mud that like the ruins in South America, that you have these large megalithic structures all over that have just been toppled in mud. In the Andes, like Lake Titicaca, why are there seahorses? At how many upheavals and downheavals, indications of massive catastrophic events, like, again, all the
crater
cities
in Greenland even.
Yeah, the Greenland. Then we have, because there's the distinction. Is it in Greenland? Is it the 19-mile wide diametered crater impact that is under the under the Greenland ice sheet? And when the impact of that is analyzed, it's just terrifying what the planet went through. Or the Yucatan, the giant crater, the dinosaur killer, the one forever we thought, oh, you know what, the reason it's all carved out, this meteor hit that was even bigger, and it just wiped out the dinosaurs. And there's that. But then the planet, if on this 15,000 year, okay, we could argue that on an elliptical cycle of 15,000 years and over 4 billion years, so that we look at it against how long is the planet here, or our planet as we kind of see it now, and based on the number of times, based on a binary star system, that this planet would circle by the Earth, how much, based on the other objects in space that these Caltech Sci guys have said, well, there's this much draw on the planet's orbit that it's causing this wobble. And over this time, will this last, like 15,000 years ago, this wobble wasn't a wobble, but it became a wobble that year, and it was just wobbly enough that it caused tidal waves, or it caused earthquakes.
Yeah, or it caused a flood even.
Right. So is it possible that we're 12,500 years in, and we're looking at this planet coming back at us within a couple thousand years? And the reason I brought up the radio frequency telescopes is because to this day right now, that, like that song, The Age of Aquarius, we actually, there is a debate among scientists and based on the wobble, whether or not we're like 3,000, 3,200 years out of, like, we still have a ways to go to get into Aquarius, or we're in Aquarius. They're actually not positive. And when we look at objects like Nibiru, or when we look out, here's the thing, we haven't actually seen Nibiru. We actually haven't seen the secondary star. And we have these telescopes that we're pointing into deep space and different areas. And, for everyone's basic conversation here, if we want to use a really high-tech $1 trillion, whatever it costs, satellite to take a picture of anything, there's a lot of scientists around the world that have to wait with and present like, hey, I want to borrow this telescope for so many minutes, and I want to point it in this direction, and I want to take pictures of blah, 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 blah. Well, you get that window of opportunity for those many minutes to do that thing. It's not like we can have a quick conversation or a long one with anyone of any direct control of the Hubble or any other satellite like it, public or military or otherwise, and then say, okay, well, we want to look for Nibiru. It's up to amateurs. It's up to anybody who's maybe pointing and looking for some other star structure or comet or asteroid, or you fill in the blank, to point an actual visual telescope into a zone of space and accidentally catch a star that is so much closer than a whole other galaxies. And we have not actually photographed it yet. The mathematical evidence is there. So wouldn't it be cool if we could dedicate some time to actually try to photograph this other star and this other planet that is supposed to be just so close to us, and yet we're out analyzing star systems, trillions and trillions and trillions of miles away.
Yeah, I mean, there's just no telling what's out there, I guess.
Yeah, and I guess it comes down to priorities. And I think that being more conscious that the human history is much more complex than we've been leading ourselves to believe, and as we realize that it's more complex, I think there should be some priority to map more of the ruins that are underwater, in deep water, and also in near deep space, to look for this binary star and get a photograph of this second Earth system that very much could be attached to our own planet. But we have to turn the satellites in our time, because I do think that the technology and our own genetic information and what we're learning about, even recording information on genes, that it's already been done. And there's a reason we have these different superhuman abilities and these deja vu memories and these giants that we know of and these stories, that they are not just coincidence or tall tales. Got that one in there. Tall tales.
Yeah, there's definitely those mudslides in Africa you're telling me about. Do we have them dated? How long ago did that take place?
Well, there's photoluminescence, and there's a lot of different ways to date things around mud, organics that have been left in them. But it's just like stone. We have very limited, we have no way to date stone or sand. We literally need one piece of sand to do this photoluminescence. But to actually accurately date, we can't. We don't know. But when you have 40, 50, 60 feet of mud that used to not be there, well, yes. Is there sloughing off of hillsides? Are there avalanches after erosion? Yeah. When you account for everything, and there's still this unexplainable wall of mud that's settled in, was it because the whole area was underwater and it just was shifting bottom sands of a lake, of a river, both, of a flood? And then what does it look like? We're not done doing that research. It's unexplored in that area for the most part, geologically, and even for the archaeology that's being done just specifically in that area where I was. There is every square inch is ruins, every square inch of the land. It's incredible. And there's almost no information on it. And so this mud wall, you can see it at Tiwanaku in South America. You have giant megalithic blocks and stones in layers and layers of mud. And again, you got seahorses in Lake Titicaca. It's almost 13,000 feet above sea level. South Africa was at 5,000, where I was on average, where I was at was about 5,000 feet above sea level. Pretty safer place to be if the water rises. Not a bad place to be. But then at 13,000 feet, you got Lake Titicaca with seahorses in it. I mean, at some point, you got to stop scratching your head going, oh, that's interesting. Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah. Wasn't that a mystery?
That is interesting. Jared, where can people find you?
I am on Amazon for It's Not Aliens, Worse, It's Us, Discovering Our Lost History. I'm there, and I do have a YouTube channel at Not Aliens, trying to post more, but I'm spending more time with great podcasters like you and radio shows.
So, any good shows you've been on, interesting shows you've been on that you want to point people towards?
Yeah, I was just on Cliff Dunning's Earth Ancients. That was just over a week ago, and I was on Gary's show. There's apparently there's a few people listening in Canada. That was fun. It's Night Dreams Talk Radio, and I was just on Gary's show last week, and that's actually, I know they run live and here and in Canada, but I do know they do streaming and podcasts and recordings of their shows too. So that was fun. And Cliff's was, I'm pretty sure you can get that show on, I think that one's on Facebook. I don't know how they release all of their shows, because I think they paused on the YouTube, because I just asked Cliff about that a couple days ago. So yeah, Earth Ancients with Cliff Dunning, and Night Dreams Talk Radio, and of course here.
Yeah. And this is Conflict Radio. You can always find Jared Murphy's page on our website. If you go to conflictradio.net, just hit the guest tab and look for Jared Murphy, and you can read all about him there, and all of his links and everything's there, as well as down in the description box below. You'll find all the links to Jared's stuff. Jared, we really appreciate you coming on. Man, I get so many guests, and we talk about so many different things, and it's nice to be able to ground myself with you a little bit and kind of put everything together, be it Planet X, the Crystal Skulls, or Giants, and try to see how it all pieces together with somebody who's done a lot of research on ancient technology and that sort of thing. We really appreciate you coming on.
I really had a good time, and it's always great to be on your show, so I really appreciate all of that, too. Thank you.
All right, and we hope to get you on again soon with a special guest, and we'll save that for a surprise, and we'll be right back with Conflict Radio right after this. Welcome back to Conflict Radio. I hope you enjoyed the show today. It was definitely fun to do. Remember to like and subscribe if you're watching us on YouTube. If not, be sure to catch us on all of the normal podcast catchers. We got informed today via email that we are now available on iHeartRadio. So if you have iHeartRadio, be sure to search Conflict Radio on iHeartRadio or iHeartMedia or iHeart whatever it is, iHeart app or whatever. And be sure to find us there. We'll be back on Thursday. Until then, be safe.